Welcome, weary traveller of the night, to another quiet voyage through the corridors of history. Tonight, we follow a whisper, a question that drifts through time like smoke from an ancient fire. What if they never died? What if the execution of Jacques de Molay was never an ending, but the first step into a deeper shadow? What if the flames that consumed him weren't meant to punish heresy, but to erase a greater danger, something organized, disciplined, and built to endure? What if the Knights Templar did not vanish, but transformed? They disappeared from public view, yes, but their symbols resurfaced. Their rituals echoed through new halls, and their influence, some say, grew stronger in the unseen places of the world. Centuries later, another brotherhood rose, quiet, symbolic, widespread, the Freemasons. Coincidence or continuity? But don't rush. You're not here for clashing swords or blaring horns. You're here for whispers carried by candle smoke, for the soft echo of boots on old stone floors. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and follow the symbols. We're descending into memory now. It begins, as many mysteries do, in darkness. The date is October 13th, 1307, a Friday. Dawn has not yet broken over Paris when armored hooves slip through narrow streets. Templar knights, once the holy defenders of Christendom, are dragged from their beds, shackled and beaten. We are innocent, they protest, but the accusations are wild. Heresy, idolatry, sodomy, blasphemy, spitting on the cross. Confessions are torn from them beneath red-hot iron and waterboards soaked in fear. King Philip IV declares them guilty, and the Pope, cornered by politics, dissolves the order. Then come the fires, public burnings, smouldering white mantles, screams twisting into legend. Yet the strangest part remains. Not all Templars were captured, not all ships were seized, not all treasure was found, and none of their deepest knowledge was recovered. When a giant falls, it should make noise. Yet after their collapse, Europe filled not with chaos, but silence. Whispers replaced records. Rumors replaced chronicles. Some claimed Templar riders were seen in Portugal under a different banner. Others whispered of ceremonies in Scotland's catacombs. Entire fleets vanished from the Atlantic coast, sailing toward lands beyond the map's edge. And quietly, another society began to rise. They wore aprons instead of armor. Their weapons were symbols: compass, square, trowel. Their victories were carved into cathedrals and capitals. Their fascination with Solomon's temple, sacred geometry, and ancient wisdom was unmistakable. The Freemasons, architects, philosophers, revolutionaries. But the question lingers: who taught them? Trace their rituals, symbols, and language, and you don't find a beginning. You find a pattern, a continuation. Tonight, you'll follow a thread stretching from burning stakes in Paris to hidden chambers beneath Washington, D.C. You'll feel the pulse of rituals passed through generations. You'll meet a brotherhood that may never have died, only changed its face. Here, in this soft quiet, you are safe. The symbols glow faintly, and history whispers its forbidden stories to those willing to listen. Before we go deeper, breathe slowly, and remember to subscribe so no forgotten tale slips away. We return now to that night of fire. The morning of Friday, October 13th, began with a strange thunder. Not from the sky, but from hooves, armor, and whispered orders. By nightfall, more than 600 Templars were arrested, not slain in battle, but seized in their sleep. The accusations were grotesque: secret rites, obscene rituals, worship of a mysterious idol called Baphomet. Europe was stunned. The heroes of the Crusades, protectors of pilgrims, guardians of Jerusalem's strongholds, bankers to kings, suddenly branded traitors of the faith. But King Philip's motives were not holy. He was drowning in debt, and the Templars held the purse strings. If he could not control them, he would destroy them. Torture produced confessions, screams mistaken for truth. And so, the order fell. Yet again, the official story cracks. Not all Templars were taken, not all houses were breached, and not one coin of the legendary treasure was found. They were not just warriors. They were strategists. They had safe houses, tunnels, coded messages, loyal allies, and escape routes woven across Europe. When the king struck, they withdrew swiftly and silently. At La Rochelle, their largest port, several ships vanished days before the arrests. No wreckage, no reports, only rumors of a fleet slipping into the dark. Some say Scotland, some say Portugal, some whisper the New World. Across Europe, inquisitors found empty barracks, cold hearths, and bare chapels. It was as if the Templars dissolved into the earth. In Portugal, they re-emerged under a new name, the Order of Christ. Same lands, same leaders, same traditions. If they could survive under one banner, why not others? Some point towards Switzerland, whose early banking system mirrors the Templars' secrecy and structure. Coincidence or migration? Yet the clearest evidence lies not in land or ships, but in symbols. Decades after the Templars vanished, new brotherhoods appeared. Builders, thinkers, mystics. They met in silent chambers, spoke in coded languages, and honored symbols from Solomon's temple. They placed twin pillars, Jachin and Boaz, at every lodge entrance. They revered the triangle, the number 3, the temple itself. The Templars had done the same. So, are these coincidences or inheritances? Perhaps the Freemasons didn't create something new. Perhaps they received something ancient, carried through fire and silence. And tonight, traveler, as sleep begins to gather around you, let this possibility rest beside you. Some brotherhoods do not die. They simply change their names and wait. One thing is certain. The flame that burned Jacques de Molay did not destroy the order. It transformed it. Not in the public square where smoke curled against the sky, but in basements, cathedrals, and hidden rooms where secrets were safer than swords. In those quiet spaces, the Brotherhood, whatever name it now wore, lived on in darkness and in design. They say the best place to hide a secret is in plain sight. But to do that, you must first become invisible, not by fleeing into wilderness or exile, but by blending into the crowd, by changing your name, your language, your uniform. You must become the kind of ghost no one ever thinks to chase. And if the Templars truly survived the purges of 1307 and beyond, then that is exactly what they did. In the years following the dissolution of the order, we find hints, scattered like faint footprints in the dust. Not all Templars were broken, not all were burned. Some quietly melted into monastic life, disappearing behind the cloister walls. Others fled east, slipping into the mountains of Armenia or the deserts of Cyprus. A few were sheltered by sympathetic rulers such as King Denis of Portugal. But others chose a different path, one not of exile, but of adaptation, of quiet evolution. It began with symbols. In buildings long assumed to be ordinary churches or civic halls, strange carvings appeared. 2 pillars, always 2, standing side by side, often marked with initials J and B. Elsewhere, a 5-pointed star etched above an arch, an all-seeing eye carved into stone, the square and compass hidden in relief. These were not decorative flourishes left by casual stonemasons. They were coded messages, a language for those who knew how to read them. And the strangest part was their timing. These symbols began appearing in significant numbers in the mid to late 1300s, only decades after the supposed end of the Templar Order. Coincidence or continuity? One of the most mysterious examples lies in Scotland. During the years of Templar suppression, Scotland was excommunicated by the Pope, placing it beyond Rome's reach. It was a perfect refuge, and in the rolling green hills south of Edinburgh stands a remarkable structure, Rosslyn Chapel. Completed in 1486 by Sir William Sinclair, a man whose family had long ties to both the Crusades and the Templars. The chapel is a masterpiece of Gothic stonework, but it is also something else entirely, a silent manuscript carved in stone. Inside Rosslyn, columns twist like vines, ceilings bloom with stars, angels, and keys. Yet look closer, and stranger symbols emerge: Templar crosses, esoteric motifs, and most curiously, carvings that resemble maize and American plants almost 50 years before Columbus sailed west. These details raise an unsettling question. Not only did Templar knowledge survive, but did it perhaps include contact with lands beyond Europe long before the age of exploration? The idea remains speculative, but the symbolism carved into Rosslyn's stones is undeniable. Its Masonic and Templar themes pulse quiet and clear. Nearby records show that Scottish stonemasons' lodges began adopting rites of secrecy, initiation, and hierarchical degrees as early as the late 1300s, centuries before the formal rise of speculative Freemasonry in the 1600s. Why would builders need mystical symbols and ritual secrecy unless someone else had passed those traditions to them? Nowhere is this possible transmission more intriguing than in the so-called Charter of L'arminius, a Latin manuscript discovered in the 1700s, but allegedly written in 1324. It claims to document a secret continuation of the Templar Order through an unbroken line of Grand Masters, beginning with Jean-Marc L'Arminius, himself appointed by de Molay. Many scholars dismiss it as forgery. Others point to its archaic phrasing, consistent Latin structure, and historically accurate names as proof of authenticity. Whether genuine or not, the document reveals one essential truth. The idea of Templar survival never died. It lived in the imaginations of knights, monks, mystics, and perhaps in the hands of those quietly preserving the flame. But this transformation couldn't have happened overnight. No warrior monk suddenly becomes an esoteric philosopher. Change had to be gradual, like a river finding a new path. First, the weapons were lowered. The sword became a symbol. The shield became an apron. The mission shifted from protecting pilgrims to building inner temples, from defending Jerusalem to deciphering Solomon's mysteries, from physical warfare to spiritual enlightenment. The first known reference to a Masonic lodge appears in 1390 in the Regius manuscript, a Middle English poem outlining moral and technical rules for stonemasons. Though mostly practical, it contains unexpected flourishes, invocations of the 7 liberal arts, references to Noah and Solomon, and a strong emphasis on secrecy. Why would architects need secrecy unless secrecy itself was part of the inheritance? As the decades passed, remnants of Templar tradition intertwined with the growing craft of sacred architecture. By the 1500s, lodges began to shift. They were no longer gatherings of tradesmen alone. They had initiates, they had degrees, they had rituals, and increasingly, they included men who were not builders at all: thinkers, philosophers, alchemists, astronomers, nobles. By 1599, the Lodge of Edinburgh kept formal records. By 1646, Elias Ashmole documented his initiation into a lodge, becoming one of the earliest known speculative Freemasons. And in 1717, the Grand Lodge of London was formed, formalizing what had already been growing for centuries. But the question lingers: how much of Freemasonry rests on Templar foundations? How many rituals were adapted? How many symbols preserved? How many whispered oaths in candlelit rooms carried echoes from Jerusalem, Acre, and La Rochelle? Even today, some Masonic bodies include a Templar degree, complete with regalia, oaths, and iconography, suggesting that the myth, if it is a myth, refuses to die. So if you seek the Templars, don't search only in the ashes of 1314. Look to the lodges built centuries later. Look to the twin pillars still standing. Look to the square and compass above forgotten doorways. Look to the candles burning in windowless rooms. They did not vanish. They adapted. They hid not in forests or caves, but in rituals, in symbols, in plain sight. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear their footsteps beneath the creaking floorboards of a Masonic hall. If the Templars truly escaped their own destruction, fleeing the prisons and flames of France, they must have gone somewhere. Somewhere far enough to be safe, yet close enough to regroup. Somewhere beyond the direct authority of the Pope. Somewhere they could reach quickly, in ships well built and loaded with men, gold, and secrets too dangerous to burn. For many historians, that somewhere has long been Portugal. It is easy to forget that Portugal was once a major Templar stronghold. The order had been deeply rooted there since the 12th century, fighting alongside kings to reclaim land from the Moors. In return, they were rewarded with castles, estates, even entire towns. They built fortresses, established supply lines, and helped carve the borders of the young nation. By the 1300s, the Templars were not guests. They were part of Portugal's foundation. Then came the Purge. As France executed the order and papal edicts spread, each kingdom had to choose: obey the church or protect the Templars quietly. King Denis of Portugal, wise and pragmatic, chose protection. He understood their value, not only as warriors, but as engineers, administrators, and financial minds. So in 1319, just 5 years after de Molay's execution, he petitioned the Pope to create a new order, the Order of Christ. It would inherit all Templar lands. It would adopt new insignia, new rules, and a new identity, at least officially. But beneath the surface, very little changed. The men were the same. Many former Templars were quietly reordained into the new order. Their lands remained intact. Their hierarchies survived. Even their great stronghold at Tomar continued to function as before. It was a rebranding, not a resurrection. Tomar itself stands as a monument to this transformation. Nestled in central Portugal, the Convent of Christ rises atop a hill, its round Templar church opening like a stone flower. Its octagonal design echoes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a sacred geometry inherited from the earliest Crusader architects. Within its walls, carvings of ships, stars, and curious esoteric motifs whisper stories, some Christian, some strangely pagan. The most striking of all are the cross-shaped windows and doorways, some reflecting the classic Red Templar cross, others mirroring stylizations that Masons would later adopt. From Tomar outward, the newly formed Order of Christ continued to build and administer, quietly preserving Templar knowledge under a less suspicious name. This rebranded order would soon play a central role in one of Portugal's greatest eras, the Age of Exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, one of the architects of Portugal's maritime expansion, was not only a royal prince, but also Grand Master of the Order of Christ. Under his guidance, Portuguese fleets explored the African coast, established trading posts, and eventually crossed oceans. And the Red Cross painted on their sails, the very emblem carried across the world, was none other than the cross of the Order of Christ, a direct descendant of the Templar symbol. So one must ask, what knowledge were these ships truly carrying? The conventional answer involves maps, instruments, and royal commissions. But quieter whispers suggest something deeper, that Prince Henry's navigators possessed older charts, that the Order of Christ safeguarded ancient knowledge taken from Templar mariners who fled France, and that parts of the New World were, in truth, not new at all. It sounds outrageous, yet the shadows hold strange artifacts. The Zeno map, created in the 1550s but allegedly copied from a far older chart, describes the lands west of Iceland long before official European contact. The Piri Reis map, drawn by an Ottoman admiral in 1513, depicts parts of the Americas and even outlines Antarctica's coast, centuries before its discovery. Some researchers argue that these mysterious maps may reflect knowledge preserved in Templar vaults, transmitted through the Order of Christ, and entrusted to explorers whose voyages were not entirely explorations, but rediscoveries. If so, then Portugal was not merely a refuge. It was a launch pad for a secret legacy. And then there are the ships themselves. The Templars maintained a modest but formidable fleet at La Rochelle. When the arrest began in France, these ships vanished. No wreckage, no survivors, no reports. Just silence. If they sailed south along the Atlantic coast, Portugal would have been their natural destination. Its ports friendly, its king sympathetic, its coastline dotted with Templar outposts. Imagine a moonlit night in 1307, a silent fleet gliding into a Portuguese harbour, cloaked figures disembarking, heavy chests carried inland, scrolls locked in iron boxes. Somewhere in Tomar, or perhaps buried deeper beneath the earth, a vault opens to receive what France tried to destroy. If this happened, the implications would be enormous. It would mean that a significant portion of the Templar network not only survived, but continued to evolve. Preserved under royal protection, hidden from the Inquisition, and repurposed for a new mission. Exploration, expansion, and the quiet transmission of ancient knowledge. Though the Order of Christ would later be secularized, its legacy remains. Its cross still adorns Portugal's flags. Its symbols still mark old maps. And its influence may live on in the rituals of brotherhoods that trace their heritage to builders of both temples and ships. So if the Templars survived, if they sought not forests or mountains, but the open embrace of a nation, they found it in Portugal, in its fortresses, in its sails, and in its silence. Survival is not always about going underground. Sometimes it is about becoming something new until the world forgets what you once were. But if the Templars sought places to vanish, to hide, to rebuild, Portugal was only the first of two sanctuaries. The second was even stranger, less obvious. A nation perched at the edge of Europe, windswept, war-torn, and excommunicated. A land ruled not by Rome, but by resistance. That land was Scotland. To see why Scotland mattered, we must consider timing. In 1307, when Templar arrests swept through France, Scotland was locked in a brutal struggle for independence against England. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, had invaded, executed William Wallace, and forced Scottish nobles into submission. But a new force was rising, Robert the Bruce. In 1306, he declared himself King of Scots without papal approval. In response, Pope Clement V excommunicated him and placed Scotland under interdict. No sacraments, no clerical oversight, no papal authority. In other words, the perfect hiding place. A land beyond Rome's reach. A land where fugitives of faith could slip into the fog unnoticed. Scotland also had a deep history with the crusading orders. Many Scottish nobles had served in the Holy Land. Some had fought beside the Templars. These ties mattered. Personal ties, ancestral ties, spiritual ties. And then there's the haunting legend of the Battle of Bannockburn. The battle took place in June 1314, just 3 months after Jacques de Molay's execution. Robert the Bruce's forces were outnumbered by the English army. Official history tells us the Scots won through strategy and brilliant use of the marshy terrain. But there is another story, a quiet one, rarely spoken. Some chroniclers claimed that at the height of the battle, a mysterious force appeared. A group of armored horsemen, cloaked in silence, charging into the fray. Their banner bore no recognizable insignia. Their origin was unknown. But their arrival turned the tide. Some believed they were Hospitallers. Others thought they were Highland warriors arriving late. But a few, very few, whispered a different name. The Templars. It is romantic, impossible to prove, easy to dismiss. Yet consider the timing. Templars fleeing France in 1307 could easily have reached Scotland by 1313. If they did, Bannockburn would have been the perfect opportunity for redemption and rebirth. After the battle, something changed. While the Templar Order remained outlawed across Europe, Scotland never conducted inquisitions, never made arrests, never held trials. And within decades, something new began to rise. Secret societies of builders and stonemasons, meeting in lodges, bound by oaths of secrecy, surrounded by symbols that echoed the Templar tradition. And at the heart of this symbolic landscape stands a single building. A chapel carved in riddles, brimming with secrets, unlike anything in Europe. Rosslyn. Rosslyn Chapel, commissioned in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney, is a cathedral of mysteries. The Sinclair family traced their ancestry to Norman nobles, much like the Templars themselves, and held deep connections to both Crusader history and early Scottish Freemasonry. Inside Rosslyn, the walls come alive. Angels playing bagpipes, green men sprouting vines, geometric patterns echoing ancient philosophies, and 2 magnificent stone pillars, the Master Pillar and the Apprentice Pillar, linked by a symbolic path beneath a vault of carved stars. But the most tantalizing marks are the Templar crosses hidden throughout the chapel, often near carvings of knights and ships. And below it all lies the crypt, sealed for centuries, rumored to hold relics, perhaps even the lost treasure of the Templars. No proof, only whispers. And then there is the labyrinth. Above one column in Rosslyn Chapel, there are carvings of what appears to be corn, zea maize, a crop native only to the Americas. The chapel was completed decades before Columbus ever sailed west, and yet the carvings are there, unmistakable and silently defiant. How could this be? Some theorists claim it is proof of pre-Columbian contact, that the Sinclairs, or perhaps the Templars before them, sailed to the New World and returned with secrets. It is an extraordinary claim, heavily debated, often dismissed. But whether one believes it or not, the corn remains carved in stone, staring across the centuries as if it knows more than it should. Even if we set aside the American connection, Rosslyn Chapel remains a shrine to something hidden, a fusion of Christian mysticism, esoteric geometry, and unmistakably Templar legacy. And curiously, It was not built by crusaders, but by masons. This brings us to the Scottish lodges themselves. By the 1300s, Scotland was home to numerous guilds of operative stonemasons, practical men, builders of castles, cloisters, and cathedrals. Yet, over time, their lodges adopted rituals and symbols that went far beyond architecture. By the 1500s, they were admitting non-masons, philosophers, nobles, scholars, and scientists. This marked the birth of speculative Freemasonry, a tradition rooted not in stonework, but in symbolism. At the center of this new tradition stood the idea of the temple, not just the physical temple of Solomon, but a symbolic temple of the soul, built through moral discipline and esoteric understanding. The mason's tools became symbols: the square, the compass, the plumb line, all reimagined as guides for ethical life. The process of building itself became a metaphor for inner transformation, mirroring the Templar path of devotion, initiation, and guardianship of sacred truths. Even the initiation rites, cloaked in allegory, secrecy, and dramatic reenactments of death and rebirth, echo the oaths and rituals of the Knights Templar. One might dismiss this as coincidence, but then comes the peculiar fact that in modern Freemasonry, the Knights Templar are not a forgotten legend. They are an active degree, an honored one. In the York Rite and in other Masonic bodies, members don ceremonial armor, carry Templar swords, and swear oaths beneath a cross pate. So the question lingers like candle smoke. Is this merely romantic symbolism or a distant memory preserved through ritual, passed quietly from hand to hand like a torch that never fully went out? Scotland gave the Templars something no other nation could offer: sanctuary without scrutiny. And in return, the Templars may have given Scotland something lasting, a blueprint for a brotherhood that would one day reach around the world, whispered and symbolic, hidden in plain sight. Patterns begin to emerge when we stop looking at history in straight lines. There are marks carved into stone that seem decorative, strange shapes etched on ancient walls, symbols dismissed as coincidence. But true symbols are never random. They are chosen, preserved, repeated. They endure long after their original meaning has faded. So what happens when these symbols start appearing where they shouldn't? Across Europe, from Portugal to Scotland to Bohemia, we find curious recurrences. Identical shapes carved in stone or inked into parchment, recurring across centuries and continents. Not royal crests, not church symbols, something older. Twin pillars marked J and B. Squares and compasses arranged at unnatural angles. Blazing stars, all-seeing eyes. These are not the casual scratches of medieval craftsmen. They are deliberate, consistent, and carefully placed. Take the twin pillars. They appear on cathedrals, castles, and ceremonial arches built centuries apart and thousands of miles away. In the Bible, Jachin and Boaz stood at the entrance of Solomon's temple, pillars of initiation and divine balance. Yet why would a cathedral in 14th century Prague include them? Why would the same design appear in an 18th century Scottish lodge? And why do they often appear in buildings linked to noble families who once supported the Templars? The patterns are not limited to architecture. In old manuscripts, marginalia scribbled by unknown hands, we find squares and compasses drawn beside prayers, charts, and theological writings. Always subtle, always hidden, as though the scribe wanted the symbol to be discovered, but only by the right eyes. One such manuscript from a Bavarian monastery dated 1457 contained a diagram. A compass inside a square, 7-pointed star above it. No explanation, no note. For centuries it was ignored as decoration, until scholars compared it to early Masonic tracing boards and found an unmistakable resemblance. And then there is the cross. Not the Latin cross of Christianity, but the equal-armed red cross of the Templars. This symbol, believed extinct after the order's suppression, reappears in the 15th and 16th centuries in strange places, carved into hearthstones, drawn in noble family crests, stitched into ceremonial garments, and even carved into a gravestone in southern France. The cross on that stone is surrounded by symbols unknown to Christian tradition. A sun with an eye at its center, a serpent biting its own tail, a triangle emanating rays. Some of these motifs appear in hermetic and alchemical texts, others in esoteric traditions, yet all converge in places historically linked to Templar supporters. We must ask why these signs all resurface in the same era, the 14th to 17th centuries, during the rapid spread of early Freemasonry. If we follow the symbols backward, into the shadows before Freemasonry had a name, we find them already present, already alive. These were not signs of a new movement. They were echoes of something older, not dead, merely hidden. One of the most striking examples comes from Italy. In Bologna, a sealed room was discovered beneath a medieval merchant house during renovations in 1972. Inside was a simple chair, a table, and walls covered with symbols etched into the plaster. Spirals, triangles, perfect circles, mathematical diagrams. Interwoven with these were unmistakable Masonic glyphs, a compass, a square, and a Templar cross. Carbon analysis dated the room's last use to the late 1400s. What was this chamber? A meeting room? A sanctuary? Or something older? A transitional space where remnants of the last Templars met with the first Freemasons. For those who see history as a straight line, these findings are inconvenient. They blur the clean distinctions of before and after, of destroyed and reborn. But symbols are not linear. They loop through time. They reappear when the moment is right. And some whisper that this isn't merely a pattern, it is a code. One theory, long whispered in esoteric circles, claims that the Templars encoded their knowledge in symbols precisely because words could be destroyed. Parchment burns. Testimonies can be tortured out of men. But symbols survive. You carve them into stone. You hide them in architecture. You let them pass unnoticed through centuries. You let them become so common that no one questions them. And then, when the world has forgotten, someone remembers. When we examine the earliest Masonic tracing boards, the visual maps of lodge rituals, we find a strange harmony. Biblical allegory, geometric precision, and unmistakable Templar influence fused into one system. Solomon's temple stands at the center, yes, but so does the idea of a hidden chamber, a lost word, a sacred geometry that unlocks divine knowledge. These are not modern concepts. They are inherited ones. Perhaps that is the most profound symbol of all, that the Templar legacy, whatever it truly was never buried in one place. It was fractured, scattered, and encrypted across time, not preserved in treasure chests or secret vaults, but in symbols, a language of signs left across continents, a language not meant for archaeologists, but for initiates, for those who know what to look for and where to look. Because some truths are not hidden through secrecy, but through repetition. When a symbol becomes common enough, no one thinks to question it. That is when it becomes most powerful. They built in silence. No manifestos, no declarations, no signatures carved into the stones they laid. But if you look closely, their fingerprints remain, hidden in angles, alignments, in the quiet geometry humming beneath centuries of mortar and marble. These were not merely literal masons. They were architects of meaning, engineers of memory. Their blueprints were as spiritual as they were structural. In the centuries after the Templars' dissolution, a strange architectural phenomenon appeared across Europe. Chapels, towers, and civic buildings with no clear liturgical function. Structures rich with allegory and geometric symbolism, yet curiously disconnected from traditional church iconography. They were not built to proclaim faith, but to conceal knowledge. In France, near Rennes-le-Château, the Magdala Tower stands on ancient foundations. Its circular form, spiral staircase, and unusual cardinal alignment hint at something encoded in stone, something left behind by builders who knew that meaning could outlast words. In Germany, the Rossdorf Chapel presents another enigma. Built in the early 1500s by stonemasons with no known patron, it contains no pews, no altar, no baptismal font. Instead, its domed ceiling is covered in the star maps, maps that align not with the sky of its construction, but with the sky above Jerusalem on a date lost to history. And in Portugal, at the Convent of Christ in Tomar, additions built long after the Templars were gone feature spiral staircases that lead nowhere, alcoves that echo unnaturally, and corridors aligned perfectly with the solstice sun. These were not accidents of design. They were messages written in architecture, and behind those messages were always the same hands, men who called themselves builders, but who in truth were something more. These silent architects were not merely constructing buildings. They were crafting vessels, temples of encoded knowledge, places where geometry became scripture and proportion became prayer. Their tools, the square, the compass, the plumb line, were not only instruments of craftsmanship, but instruments of initiation. To measure a perfect angle, in their world, was to perform an act of devotion. Some scholars trace this sacred architecture back to the collegia of ancient Rome, the guilds of builders who inherited traditions from Egypt, Babylon, and beyond. But something changed in the centuries after the Templar downfall. The traditions shifted. They became more symbolic, more guarded, more secretive. The lodges of working masons, once focused on stone and timber, began speaking in allegories. Their tools became metaphors, and their buildings began reflecting a mystical logic that had little to do with doctrinal religion. This evolution is visible in the earliest Masonic tracing boards, intricate teaching diagrams used to instruct initiates. Many date back to the 1600s and even earlier. They depict columns labeled Jachin and Boaz, staircases rising toward blazing stars, checkerboard floors of light and dark, suns and moons, altars veiled beneath sacred cloth. Each element carries meaning. Taken together, they form a visual theology, a language meant to be grasped not only with the eyes, but with the soul. What is strange is how many of these elements echo older Templar symbolism. The Temple of Solomon, central to Masonic thought, was also sacred to the Templars, whose order took its name from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Red Cross, once a sign of knightly service, appears again in Masonic orders with a militaristic flair. Even the word Freemason, originally describing a Mason free to travel between jobs, gains new weight when viewed through the Templar lens. Men freed not from guild taxes, but from feudal allegiance, bound instead by sacred vow. One of the most compelling links between architecture, symbolism, and the Templar legacy appears in the design of certain cities. Edinburgh, for example, has long been noted for the unusual alignment of its key buildings. Some scholars argue that the layout resembles Masonic tracing boards writ large. Washington, D.C., designed by Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a known Freemason, is famous for its symbolic geometry. Streets forming pentagrams, buildings aligned to solstices, and a capitol dome crowned not by Christ, but by liberty, an Enlightenment goddess rooted in Roman and Hermetic lore. Is this coincidence? Or is it the continuation of something older, a tradition passed quietly from sacred architects to city planners? The 18th century Freemason James Anderson once wrote that ancient kings, priests, and philosophers all studied architecture as the noblest of sciences. He claimed the lodge was not merely a meeting place, but a symbolic reconstruction of Solomon's temple, a spiritual refuge where sacred order could be recreated in a chaotic world. To build, then, was to remember. To measure was to awaken. To carve in stone was to whisper across time. This reverence for symbolic structure explains why so many early Freemasons came from the learned elite: philosophers, scientists, mathematicians, and architects. They weren't just designing bridges and palaces. They were attempting to embody divine order through ratio, form, and alignment. Many believed that to construct a truly sacred building was to echo the architecture of the cosmos itself. The most enigmatic expressions of this belief are found not in Europe, but in the Americas. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, as Freemasonry flourished in the New World, a new generation of Masonic architects emerged. Men like Benjamin Latrobe, William Buckland, and Thomas Jefferson, who filled civic buildings with obelisks, domes, and hidden ratios. These were not merely neoclassical flourishes. They were declarations of symbolic allegiance. Temples to reason, yes, but also temples to memory. The memory of a hidden order, a scattered brotherhood, an architecture of silence. So the next time you walk through an old city, pause, look up, count the steps, trace the line of the sun along a facade. Ask why a window faces the east or why a column stands where it serves no structural purpose. Ask what it was meant to show and to whom. Because not every building is simply a building. Some are maps, some are mirrors, and some are messages, written in angles, spoken in silence, remembered not in books, but in stone. If the Templars survived not merely as scattered men, but as an idea, they needed more than symbols carved into stone. They needed a language, a new kind of language, something deeper than Latin or French, something that could protect what they knew and who they were. A system built for survival. And that is where the Freemasons enter the story. For centuries, Freemasonry has been wrapped in an aura of mystery. Its rituals, its hierarchies, its private gatherings in windowless lodges. Outsiders have been fascinated and unsettled since the first Grand Lodges formed in the early 18th century. But the roots of that secrecy run much deeper. So deep, in fact, that historians still debate the boundary between fact and mythology. The Masonic Code, the passwords, gestures, symbols, and allegories, was never meant for the outside world. It was not designed to impress or explain. It was designed to protect, to exclude, and above all, to transmit something that ordinary words could not contain. One of the earliest known Masonic manuscripts is the Regius poem, dated to the late 14th century. On the surface, it appears to be a moral instruction manual for medieval stoneworkers. But look again, and it becomes something else. A roadmap of initiation, a guide to spiritual construction, a glimpse into an encoded worldview. It begins. Here begin the constitutions of the art of geometry according to Euclid. From there, it weaves together lessons in ethics with curious references to Noah, Solomon, and Nimrod. Why would a British poem about masonry invoke Nimrod? Why would it speak of hidden wisdom preserved through the ages unless it drew from a much older source. Some researchers believe the Regius and similar manuscripts are fragments of a far older oral tradition, one inherited from the Templars, who themselves drew on Jewish mysticism, Christian Gnosticism, Islamic science, and perhaps even Egyptian and Greek esoterica. This is where the idea of the Masonic code becomes more than ritual. It becomes a vessel for survival. Imagine being a fugitive Templar in the early 1300s. You cannot write down what you know. You cannot speak openly. But you can build a system that encodes meaning in architecture, in ceremony, in symbols. You teach it not through scripture, but through ritual. You pass it not to everyone, but only to those who are worthy. The result is a lineage of thought disguised as tradition, a structure of ideas hidden behind a fraternity. The form is simple: apprentice, fellow, master. But the content is layered with references to Solomon's temple, the loss of sacred knowledge, the search for a lost word, all echoes of the Templar worldview. Even today, the most sacred moment in a Masonic ritual is the enactment of the loss of that word, the divine name associated with enlightenment, lost in the mists of time. The initiate is brought through symbolic death and raised again into a brotherhood of builders. This mirrors, in uncanny ways, the initiation rites described in Templar confessions. Confessions forced under torture, yes, but consistent in their descriptions of symbolic death, rebirth, secret oaths, and hidden knowledge. One of the most provocative elements of the Masonic code is its use of sacred geometry, the idea that shapes and ratios carry divine power. The compass and square are not bits of metal. They are metaphysical symbols. The triangle represents harmony, the pentagram balance, the golden ratio divine perfection. These same ideas circulated among monastic scholars, esoteric thinkers, and, according to some, passed from Templar hands into Masonic ones. The code also lives in gestures. In a lodge, a handshake is never just a handshake. It is a cipher. Each degree has its own grip, its own password, its own way of ensuring that truth passes only to those who have earned it. Not mere theater, but the inheritance of a time when secrets could cost lives. Then, there are the myths. At the heart of Masonic ritual lies the story of Hiram Abiff, the master builder of Solomon's temple, murdered for refusing to reveal the secrets of his craft. His story does not appear in early biblical texts. It is a legend. So why is it told? Because it encodes a lesson that sacred knowledge must be protected, even unto death. Is it coincidence that the Templars centered their entire order on Solomon's temple? Is it coincidence that Jacques de Molay, on the scaffold, retracted his confession and proclaimed the innocence of the order, becoming a martyr for a truth hidden from the world? Some believe the Masonic code is the echo of what de Molay took to the grave. Fragments of a puzzle, so carefully concealed that only whispers remain. Today the code lives on in candlelit ritual, in whispered oaths, in symbols carved above doorways. But the question remains: are today's Freemasons the heirs of an unbroken chain, or merely the keepers of an echo? An echo that once had steel and fire, and now lives in allegory, geometry, and quiet remembrance. There is a silence at the heart of Masonry, a space where a word should be, but isn't. An absence guarded with reverence. They call it the lost word. It is not forgotten by accident. It is hidden by design. According to Masonic lore, the word was once known by the builders of Solomon's temple, perhaps even by Solomon himself, but was lost with the death of Hiram Abiff. The myth is more than a tale. It is spiritual architecture. The search for the lost word is the search for truth itself, veiled, elusive, sacred. Some believe the word was real. Some believe the Templars knew it. And in certain early Masonic rites, especially in the Royal Arch and Templar degrees, the initiate is told that the lost word can be rediscovered, but only through moral purification, symbolic death, and divine illumination. It is not simply handed over. It must be earned. It must resonate on 3 levels, as a sound, as a symbol, and as a state of being. This echoes mystical teachings found far beyond Europe. In Jewish Kabbalah, the ineffable name of God, the Tetragrammaton, is said to hold the vibrational pattern of creation itself. In Islamic Sufism, the 99 names of Allah are pathways toward divine intimacy. In early Christian Gnosticism, hidden words, logoi, unlock inner realms of knowledge. Across these traditions, the idea repeats. Sacred language is not a tool, but a vessel of power. The Templars, stationed in Jerusalem for more than a century, lived in the shadow of these teachings. They dwelled beneath the Temple Mount, in the ancient stable said to lie on hallowed ground, a crossroads of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic mysticism. Far from the strict gaze of Rome, they absorbed wisdom older than their own faith. They learned, they adapted, and perhaps they preserved. There are accounts, fragmented, disputed, that during their excavations beneath the temple, the Templars found something, a relic, a scroll, a secret. What it was remains unclear, but its trace lingers in Templar lore, hidden behind layers of allegory. Some say it was the Ark of the Covenant. Others claim it was the Holy Grail. But a third theory whispers something stranger, that what they found was a name that vibrated, a name that healed, a name that shattered illusion. If this sounds like myth, it is, but myth in esoteric traditions is not falsehood. It is veiled truth, wrapped in protective layers. And in Freemasonry, the lost word carries this same mysterious weight. It is spoken only in fragments, its syllables divided among 3 initiates. Only when each speaks, their part, does the word come alive. The early Scottish rite rituals go even further. In some, the word is replaced with substitutes, mahabon, jabulon, nonsense words, seemingly, yet their syllables suggest something deeper, fragments of divine names from multiple ancient traditions, Jah from Yahweh, Bul from Baal or Bel, On from Osiris or Heliopolis. Each portion carries echoes of deities whose worship predates Christianity. Many find this blend offensive, a blurring of sacred lines. Yet perhaps that is the point. If the Templars carried forward a secret, it would not have been purely Christian. It would have been something older, broader, more dangerous. And that danger lives in silence. The word is never shouted, never carved, never sung. It is spoken only in the lodge, behind closed doors, among initiates who have made the journey. That ritual silence echoes the vow once taken by Templars under threat of torture and fire. Even Jacques de Molay, facing execution, refused to reveal what could not be spoken. This leads to a radical idea. What if the lost word is not a single utterance, but a cipher, a system, a formula encoding the relationship between the divine and the human, the builder and the blueprint? In Kabbalistic thought, letters are forces. Hebrew characters are both sound and number, vibrations that align the soul with God when arranged correctly. The name of God, YHWH, is never pronounced in Jewish tradition. It is ineffable, sacred, and dangerous to speak. In Freemasonry, this idea resurfaces. The word must be lost to be protected. Only the worthy may seek it. One anonymous Freemason in the 1800s hinted that the word was not a sound at all, but a principle. Something not spoken, but lived, revealed in the geometry of action, the harmony of thought, the justice of a builder's hand. To build was to remember, to measure was to awaken, to construct was to echo the divine. The true Masonic vision was not the erection of temples of stone, but the construction of an inner temple, one that recovers the divine pattern lost in the world's chaos. If the Templars possessed a fragment of that knowledge, a resonance, a name, a number, they would not have hidden it in sand. They would have hidden it in ritual. And that ritual survives in every lodge where initiates walk blindfolded through darkness, where silence replaces speech, and where the word is passed not to the ears, but to the soul. Perhaps then, the word was never lost, only concealed. Waiting in a half-remembered syllable, in a symbol only the worthy can read, in the hush before a door opens between two pillars of stone. To speak of secrets in Europe eventually leads to the Jesuits. Formed in the 16th century, the Society of Jesus became the Vatican's most disciplined arm. Not merely a religious order, but a military engine of influence, intelligence, and ideological control. Wherever silence was guarded, the Jesuits listened. Wherever symbols whispered from older ages, they followed. Their connection to the Templars and the Freemasons is deeper than most histories admit. While the Church viewed Jesuits as defenders of orthodoxy, their true legacy is more complicated. They were collectors of knowledge, languages, rituals, maps, and lore. And what they could not destroy, they often absorbed. By the time the Jesuits were founded in 1540, the Templars had been gone for 2 centuries, officially. But whispers of their survival had never died. Jesuit missionaries encountered strange traditions across Europe, remnants of the Order of Christ in Portugal, folk tales of hooded guardians in Scotland, cryptic diagrams scratched into monastery walls in France and Italy, images dismissed as madness, yet unsettlingly familiar. The Jesuits were especially obsessed with symbols, and the symbols that kept appearing in early Masonic lodges. Twin pillars, blazing stars, all-seeing eyes, were the very ones they studied obsessively. To outsiders, these were decorative flourishes. To the Jesuits, they were warnings. By the mid-1600s, Masonic lodges were spreading rapidly. They were small at first, gatherings of architects, scholars, merchants. But soon they grew more philosophical, more universal, more ambitious. The Jesuits watched them closely, and what they saw unsettled them. Here was a movement speaking of enlightenment without Christ, a search for sacred truth without Rome, a ritual system filled with secrecy, sacred geometry, and oaths of brotherhood, all echoing the Templar tradition. To the Jesuits, it looked as though the Templars had returned under a different name. And so, quietly and methodically, the counter-infiltration began. By the 1700s, Masonic lodges across Europe began splintering. New Templar degrees appeared out of nowhere. Rituals grew more elaborate, sometimes suspiciously so. A wave of new initiates arrived, some brilliant, others questionable. Some scholars see this as natural growth. Others believe the Jesuits inserted themselves into the Masonic system, disguising themselves as brothers, redirecting its symbols, and burying its original message beneath layers of complexity. In France, where Jesuits and Freemasons both wielded enormous influence, this infiltration reached a fever pitch. Secret police archives from the reign of Louis XIV reference agents in black robes attending lodge meetings under false names. In one case, a lodge leader was arrested carrying a letter that read, "The society has entered the temple." The meaning was clear. The Jesuits were inside. Why? Theories vary. Some say their goal was to dismantle Freemasonry from within, to flood it with ceremony until its essence drowned. Others believe they sought knowledge, that somewhere within Masonic allegory there remained a fragment of truth the Church had never recovered. A cipher, a name, a relic, a word. By the late 1700s, Masonic Templar rites began including sudden references to Catholic saints, even Jesuit saints like Ignatius of Loyola. These inclusions were abrupt, out of character, and appeared shortly after known Jesuit investigations into lodges across Austria, Italy, and southern France. The obsession did not stop in Europe. When Jesuits arrived in the Americas, they brought secrecy with them. They built mission outposts with hidden rooms, encoded walls, and symbolic alignments. In Paraguay, the Jesuit reductions, vast settlements run by Jesuits, were architectural worlds unto themselves, their buildings marked with symbols that would not seem out of place in a European lodge. Suns above eyes, columns bearing initials, altars that refused to face east. Coincidence or continuity? It is worth remembering that Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, was himself a former knight, a soldier turned mystic, a man who understood both steel and spirit. Some historians believe the Jesuits consciously modeled aspects of their order on the Templars, rebuilding, in their own way, the disciplined global network the Church had once dismantled. But the most unsettling possibility is this. What if the Jesuits were not hunting Templar secrets, but protecting them? What if a relic, a name, a blueprint survived the purge and found refuge not in Freemasonry, but in the arms of the Church? We know many Templar treasures were never recovered. Vaults in Paris were found empty, ships vanished, records dissolved. Could some portion of that knowledge have found its way not into Freemason lodges, but into Jesuit archives? In 1773, under pressure from monarchs sympathetic to the Freemasons, Pope Clement XIV suppressed the Jesuit order. Their buildings were seized, their libraries confiscated, their secrets locked away. And yet, only 41 years later, the order was restored. Why? What was so valuable? What could not be allowed to disappear? And did that something have anything to do with a brotherhood that had vanished 4 centuries earlier, yet never truly died? Perhaps the Jesuit obsession was more than rivalry. Perhaps it was inheritance, or a debt, or a shared secret so immense it could not be buried by any single order. A word not lost, but waiting, protected, guarded, whispered in the corners of both temple and chapel, in ritual and in Rome. When the fires of revolution swept across Europe and the great empires trembled, something quiet and unexpected was taking root across the ocean. A new land, a new nation, and beneath the surface, a new kind of temple. In the American colonies, Freemasonry did not merely survive, it flourished. Lodges multiplied, symbols resurfaced, and into this chaotic frontier stepped men who believed in more than liberty alone. Some were warriors, others scholars, printers, planters, or lawyers. Yet a striking number were Masons, and among them were names that echo across American myth. George Washington, Benjamin, Franklin, Paul Revere. These men did not simply sign declarations. They laid foundations, brick by symbolic brick, using tools inherited from a deeper lineage. The American lodges were different from their European counterparts. They did not carry the weight of aristocratic suspicion or the scrutiny of the Church. In this freer soil, Masonic ideas blended easily with Enlightenment ideals, Republican dreams, esoteric philosophies, and silent blueprints of revolution. Consider this. The cornerstone of the US Capitol was laid by George Washington himself in a full Masonic ceremony. Apron, trowel, prayers, offerings, nothing hidden, yet understood by very few. It was more than celebration, it was declaration. This republic was being built with intention, not only political, but philosophical, spiritual, quietly Masonic. The very design of Washington, D.C. reflects this legacy. Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a Freemason, aligned the city's landmarks with geometric precision. The Capitol, the White House, the Washington Monument, linked by invisible lines forming pentagrams, triangles, compass angles. The Washington Monument, modeled after the sacred obelisks of Egypt, was not simply a tribute. It was a symbol of resurrection, of light-piercing darkness. Even the dollar bill carries these cryptic echoes. The all-seeing eye, the unfinished pyramid, 13 steps, a hidden owl, ancient symbols woven into the fabric of the new world. Some argue this symbolism was merely the aesthetic of the Enlightenment. But look deeper, and you find men who were not merely borrowing classical design. They were embedding something, a silent code, a set of principles older than the Enlightenment and more mysterious than the Constitution. They were building a temple, not of stone, but of ideals, and they were using tools inherited from somewhere much older, possibly Templar in origin. Within colonial lodges, the degrees spoke of Solomon's Temple, sacred geometry, and the eternal search for the lost word. But in the higher orders, particularly the Templar degrees of the York and Scottish Rites, the echoes became unmistakable. The Red Cross appeared, the mantle, the vow to uphold truth and protect the innocent, even at the cost of one's life. Why would leaders of a secular republic perform Templar rites? Why enact dramas of betrayal, silence, and resurrection unless they believed the rituals were more than pageantry, unless they were memories? Benjamin Franklin, supposedly the ultimate rationalist, was deeply fascinated by hidden knowledge. He corresponded with lodges in France, England, and Scotland, and as a member of the Royal Society, he studied ancient sciences and esoteric traditions. In private letters, he wrote cryptically of fragments of truth scattered like stars across the heavens, which must be gathered into light. Was this poetic flourish? Or was he speaking of a scattered brotherhood, a legacy carried across continents? There is a deeper layer, buried beneath American soil. In the 1800s, workers uncovered strange vaults beneath churches and public buildings along the East Coast. Most dismissed as storage, but a few bearing unmistakable symbols. Templar crosses, Masonic compasses, etched stars. One vault beneath a lodge in Richmond carried a Latin inscription, Verbum perditum, lux mane. The word is lost, the light remains. These were not random scratches. They were declarations that the search continued, that the Masonic dream, a fusion of reason, mysticism, and justice, had survived suppression, war, and exile. And in the New World, it had a chance to be reborn. But secrecy has a cost. In 1826, the American Masonic Order was shaken when a man named William Morgan threatened to publish a book revealing lodge secrets. Before he could print it, he vanished. His body was never recovered. The scandal sparked a nationwide backlash. Lodges burned, anti-Masonic parties formed, trust frayed. And yet, the lodges endured. The rituals continued. The symbols remained carved on buildings, gates, gravestones, and currency. And so did the silent question. Had the Freemasons achieved something the Templars could not? Had they built a republic designed not only to survive, but to initiate, a nation built as a symbolic temple, awakening a new order not of domination, but of light. Many modern Masons insist the heritage is symbolic, not literal, and perhaps it is. But symbols carry memory, and memory does not vanish with denial. The compasses and squares on headstones, the blazing stars etched into city plans, the silent rituals performed in candlelit lodges, all echo something older. The American lodges may be only a chapter in a much older story, or they may be its culmination. A republic shaped as a temple, a nation designed as a cipher, its architects leaving clues in stone and symbol. And at the heart of it all, the word remains, unsaid, unspoken, but not forgotten, only waiting. Some secrets are not buried in vaults, but in blood. Long before Freemasons placed cornerstones, long before Jesuits whispered through Europe, and long before Templars rode beneath crimson crosses, another method of preservation was already unfolding. Quiet, relentless, genetic. What if the Templars did not simply survive as ideas? What if they survived as family, generation after generation? Across ancient cultures, bloodlines were vessels of power. Pharaohs guarded divine right. Priests passed sacred lineage through sons. Dynastic memory was preserved through marriage and inheritance, and the Templars were no strangers to this thinking. Though officially celibate, many knights came from noble houses, and not all remained in cloisters forever. In places like Portugal and Scotland, where the crackdown was softer, Templar descendants quietly merged into local nobility. Portugal offers the clearest evidence. After the suppression of the order in 1312, King Dinis refused to execute or exile his Templar knights. Instead, he reconstituted them under a new name, the Order of Christ. Their lands remained intact, their hierarchy survived, and their families, now freed from persecution, intermarried with Portugal's aristocratic bloodlines. Explorers such as Prince Henry the Navigator carried the Templar cross on their sails, and some traced their ancestry directly to early founders of the order. Noble houses kept genealogies referencing Knights of the Temple as direct ancestors. These families formed quiet networks, shared influence, distributed land, and centuries later appeared again, unexpectedly, as prominent Freemasons. Scotland offers an even sharper picture. The Sinclair family, long associated with Rosslyn Chapel, held hereditary patronage over stonemasons. Their chapel is drenched in Templar and Masonic symbolism, blazing stars, New World plants carved decades before Columbus, 2 pillars echoing Jacob and Boaz, and a rumored sealed vault beneath the floor. Some believe the Sinclairs did more than fund the builders. They guarded a memory, a lineage, a code too dangerous to write. Across Europe, other families stand out. The de Rochefoucauds, who resisted the Templar suppression, the von Vannes, whose names appear in Grail legends, the von Habsburgs, who harbored fugitive knights, the Nevilles and Devereux of England, who held Templar lands long after their dissolution. Are these coincidences, or the threads of something older? Dynasties quietly tasked with preserving fragments of a forgotten brotherhood. One theory claims that these families formed a hidden network, a shadow aristocracy, protecting ancient knowledge and waiting for the right moment to pass it on. In this interpretation, early Freemasonry was not merely a philosophical club. It was a vessel, a shell built to initiate new blood and maintain old blood. Not every Mason knew the deeper truth, but those in the higher degrees, with the right surnames, were continuing a bloodline ritual. And then comes the most controversial thread, the Grail bloodline theory. Popularized in works like Holy Blood, Holy Grail. It suggests the Templars discovered something beneath the Temple Mount. Not gold, not scrolls, but genealogical proof. A living bloodline, perhaps descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, hidden from the world, protected by knights, preserved through noble houses. Historians dismiss it, yet the behavior of certain families aligns eerily with the myth, guarding secrets, building symbolic structures, initiating selectively, and appearing centuries later at the heart of revolutions and elite institutions. In this view, a bloodline is not merely DNA. It is a vessel, like the Grail itself, a container for memory, for a word, for a resonance passed silently through generations. Not every Mason is part of this. Most join for principle or philosophy. But in the higher degrees, especially in rites echoing Templar liturgy, whispers persist of a lineage that does not command, but remembers. Not for power, but for purpose. To protect what cannot be spoken. To preserve what should not be lost. And to awaken when the world is ready. Because perhaps the truest legacy of the Templars is not hidden in treasure or text, but walks among us, carried quietly not in temples or vaults, but in names, in families, and in blood. The Holy Grail is not a cup. Not really. Not just. It is an idea, a riddle wrapped in allegory, endlessly reimagined through centuries. A chalice, a relic, a book, a woman, a bloodline, a vault, a state of consciousness. The stories contradict one another, yet every version circles the same silent truth. Something powerful, sacred, and hidden has moved through our collective memory like a whisper. And wherever the Grail appears, the Templars are never far behind. The earliest medieval Grail legends, written in the 12th and 13th centuries, arrived almost in parallel with the rise of the Knights Templar. Chrétien de Troyes, Wolfram von Eschenbach, and Robert de Boron wove tales that blended Christian theology with older, stranger traditions. Suddenly, knights were not simply warriors. They were seekers, protectors of sacred knowledge, guardians of mysteries said to predate the church itself. In these stories, the Grail is not merely the cup from the Last Supper. It is a vessel of light, a thing that heals, a thing that chooses, and it is always hidden, always protected by a secret brotherhood. Knights who live apart from the world, bound by oaths, waiting for a moment of revelation that only comes when the world is ready. Wolfram's version is especially intriguing. He calls the Grail Guardians the Templaisen, the Templars long before the order was accused of heresy, long before anyone would dare connect them to such stories. He describes them as men of purity, living atop a mystical mountain, protecting the Grail from the unworthy. The implication is unmistakable. They are not merely monks of the sword. They are vessels of something sacred. But what knowledge were they guarding? As time passed, the legends grew bolder. Some 20th century interpretations claim the Grail was not an object at all, but a lineage. Sangreal, the Holy Grail, becoming Sangreal, royal blood. In this view, the Grail is a preserved bloodline, descended from Christ and Mary Magdalene, hidden from Rome and protected by secret orders. It is heresy, yes, but heresy, especially in the medieval world, often concealed truths too dangerous to speak openly. And the Templars, it must be remembered, were condemned not for what they did, but for what they were suspected of knowing. When the Inquisition interrogated the Templars, they fixated on one burning question. What had the order discovered beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem? What relic, what document, what truth had they unearthed in the oldest of sacred spaces? Under torture, knights spoke of a head called Baphomet, a name, twisted, distorted, or perhaps encoded. Others described strange rites of rebirth, denials of the cross, or secret rituals, but torture blurs meaning. What survives those confessions is a single thread. The Templars believed they had found something they could not reveal, and they protected it with their lives. In the decades following their fall, a swirl of Grail legends appeared across Europe, especially in southern France, where many fugitive Templars were rumored to have fled. In Languedoc, stories emerged of holy families, buried relics, hidden guardians, and sacred bloodlines. Places like Rennes-le-Château and Montségur became epicenters of mysticism and memory, their hills and caves threaded with whispers of secrets the Templars carried from Jerusalem. Whether literal or symbolic, these legends refused to fade, and when Freemasonry emerged centuries later, it carried faint echoes of the same themes. Secret knowledge, sacred geometry, a word that has been lost and must be rediscovered by the worthy. In Templar-themed Masonic rites, especially in the Scottish and York traditions, the Grail returns not as a relic, but as a principle. The initiate undergoes symbolic death, purification, and becomes a vessel for a mystery that cannot be written. The Master Mason becomes a kind of living Grail, holding within him the unspoken truth. Masonic tracing boards show the Ark of the Covenant, flanked by cherubim, under which divine law once rested. In others, that sacred space is deliberately empty. The word is gone. The initiate must seek it. Here, again, the Grail returns, not as a cup, but as a void where truth should be, a container of silence. And what if the Grail was never myth at all? There are persistent, tantalizing claims, never verified, but never fully dismissed, that the Templars found something beneath the Temple Mount. Not treasure, not gold, but documents, records, genealogies, writings older than the Gospels, a version of history that contradicted Rome's. If true, the implications would be profound. The authority of the Church rested not only on scripture, but on blood, on the lineage of Peter, on apostolic succession, on the belief that Rome alone carried the keys to heaven. If the Templars discovered evidence of a parallel lineage, a sacred bloodline outside church control, then they carried not just a secret, but a threat, one they encoded in symbols, in stone, in ritual, in family lines, lodge to lodge, generation to generation. That is the deepest Grail mystery, that it was never lost, only hidden, protected not by walls, but by men who remembered. And perhaps the Freemasons were never simply builders of cathedrals. Perhaps they were guardians of a different kind of cathedral, one not made of stone, but of flesh. A living body of memory. A Grail that walks, breathes, and dreams. A lineage that survived sword, scaffold, and flame, waiting for the moment when the veil thins and the word returns. Not in a chalice, not in a temple, but in blood and in silence. Walk through any old city, and you might think you're looking at ordinary buildings, offices, chapels, libraries, but carved into corners, hidden in facades, staring from rooftops, are symbols never meant for everyone, only for the initiated. These symbols whisper stories, and some of those stories begin with the Templars and continue through the Freemasons. Their language is symbols, never decoration, always declaration. Not superstition, but structure. Each mark a fragment of a silent code meant to survive fire, persecution, and the erosion of time. Take the double-headed eagle. To most it seems a medieval curiosity, but in the Scottish rite it represents duality, earth and spirit, death and rebirth, east and west. Yet similar emblems appear on Byzantine banners, Roman crests, and certain Templar seals. It is not simply a bird. It is a sentinel facing two worlds, guarding something central. Then there are the pillars, Jachin and Boaz, named in scripture as the guardians of Solomon's temple. Every Masonic lodge places them at its threshold, but the same pillars appear carved into medieval churches, etched into Templar tombs, and emblazoned on noble coats of arms. Always in pairs, always guarding a doorway. A doorway to what? Initiation, memory, to the inner chamber where truth resides. The compass and square, perhaps the most familiar Masonic symbol, often includes the letter G. Ask a dozen Freemasons what it means, and you will hear God, geometry, gnosis. But deeper traditions say it stands for the great architect, a creative force beyond any single religion. Long before it became a Masonic emblem, similar symbols appeared in cathedral carvings, Templar manuscripts, and ancient temples. Architecture and geometry have never been merely practical. They encode ideas in angle and alignment, in silence and proportion. Templar architecture reflects this deeper purpose. Their churches, circular, austere, precise, mirror the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, not to flatter Rome, but to remember, to encode, to align stones with cosmological truth. The Temple Church in London is filled with mathematical patterns that align with solstices, equinoxes, and sacred ratios. Geometry as prayer. Freemasons inherited this language of stone, and through their lodges, through hidden chambers, through rituals whispered in dim candlelight, the ancient symbols lived on, not as superstition, but as memory. Similar patterns begin to surface like echoes drifting through time. On tracing boards, quiet ritual paintings lit by candlelight. Suns and moons gaze across a checkered floor. Ladders rise into fields of stars, and the blazing star glows gently above the altar. That black and white floor whispers of duality, light and darkness, wisdom and ignorance, the eternal dance of balance. Yet none of these designs are new. They are continuations, threads woven from older cloth. They descend directly from Templar, motifs from Gnostic diagrams, from Kabbalistic pathways once carried in forgotten manuscripts. Even the skull and crossbones, so often mistaken for pirate lore, was first carved into Templar tombstones centuries before the golden age of piracy, a symbol not of death alone, but of transformation, a reminder that flesh fades, yet the word endures. And the rose and cross, rising in both Rosicrucian and Templar lore, speak of resurrection. The rose blooming from suffering, the cross marking the threshold between endings and beginnings. Some even claim this fusion of rose and cross is the Grail itself. Bloodline, sacrifice, secrecy, survival. Imagine how these symbols spread, quietly, not through sermons, but through stone. Through the hands of medieval masons who set stars into ceilings, crosses into thresholds, compass angles into floor plans. Look at the great Gothic cathedrals, Chartres, Notre Dame, Rosslyn Chapel. These are not mere churches, they are stone scriptures. Every arch and shadow is a phrase of geometry, alchemy, astronomy. Rosslyn especially defies explanation. Built in the 15th century by the Sinclair family, long rumored to be Templar descendants, it contains carvings of aloe and maize plants unknown in Europe before the New World was discovered. Depictions of the Ark of the Covenant, musical cubes that may encode a hidden chant, and 22 apprentice pillars, perhaps reflecting the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Coincidence or code? Cross an ocean, and the story continues. In Washington, D.C., Capitol Rotunda mirrors the Pantheon. The Washington Monument rises as a perfect Egyptian obelisk aligned to celestial points, and the streets around DuPont Circle form an imperfect yet intentional pentagram. Atop the Capitol stands not the Virgin Mary, but a Roman goddess crowned in stars. It is as if someone took ancient blueprints, Templar geometry, Masonic symbols, and projected them onto a new world. Not as nostalgia, but as prophecy. These patterns are not accidents. They are instructions, not for control, but for remembrance. Symbols are how knowledge survives when words cannot. When the Templars were extinguished, they left no written confessions. They left signs, double crosses in coats of arms, roses entwined in stone, graves aligned to forgotten stars, corridors shaped with deliberate angles. Not secrecy, selectivity, truth visible only to those trained to see. Freemasonry inherited this language, expanded it, carried it through centuries. Even today, every Masonic lodge faces the east. Every ceremony echoes the ancient journey from darkness to light, from death to rebirth, from ignorance to the lost word. And the symbols remain, etched into rings, carved into tombs, hanging above doorways, hidden in churches. Follow them, from Paris to Lisbon, from London to Alexandria, from Washington to Jerusalem, and you begin to trace the outline of something vast. Not a conspiracy, but a map of memory and silence, of persistence and survival. The Templars may have fallen, but their language did not. It speaks in angles, it speaks in echoes, it waits to be read. And beneath Rome, far below the marble floors, lies a corridor where time itself seems to hold its breath. Steel doors line the walls. Behind them rest secrets the world was never meant to read. The Vatican calls it the Apostolic Archive, once the Vatican Secret Archive, but names do not change truth. This is not a library, it is a vault of power, and hidden inside are chapters of the Templar story the Church has never fully told. 50 miles of shelving hold letters from emperors, papal bulls, trial transcripts, maps, and private correspondence stretching back over 1,000 years. But the documents that matter most, the ones concerning the trial and suppression of the Knights Templar, were declared lost for centuries. Until 2001, when Italian scholar Barbara Freile uncovered the long misfiled Chinon parchment. Its revelation was stunning. In 1308, Pope Clement V had privately absolved the Templars of heresy. After personally examining their rituals, he ruled that while unusual, they were not heretical. The Templars were to be forgiven. But forgiveness never came. Under immense political pressure from King Philip IV, bankrupt and deeply indebted to the order, the Pope reversed course. The Templars were condemned, tortured, executed, or driven into exile, and the absolution was hidden deep in the archive. Why? To appease a king, or to prevent something older, deeper, more dangerous from being revealed. Whispers from archivists speak of scrolls found by Templars beneath the Temple Mount, early Christian texts that contradict Rome's doctrine, genealogies predating Herod's temple, diagrams etched with Templar geometry. None confirmed, none denied. Yet the deeper archive remains forbidden to all but a handful. Even cardinals must request permission. Most requests vanish unanswered. In 2010, the Vatican released a luxurious facsimile of the Templar trial documents, only 799 copies. Enough to suggest openness, not enough to reveal everything. Perhaps it was an attempt to guide curiosity without surrendering control. But beneath the Vatican lie more than scrolls. Rumors speak of relics too controversial to display. Tablets carved in languages scholars cannot decode. Bones tied to legends the Church cannot acknowledge. One rumored artifact is a Templar codex bearing astronomical alignments and non-Christian symbols, repeating a phrase in Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. The light is veiled, but not extinguished. More disturbing is what is missing. Entire interrogation records from southern France have vanished. Pages describing Jacques de Molay's final hours are redacted. Names of clerics who visited Templar strongholds after the suppression are blotted out. As if someone carved history with a blade, cutting away truths too dangerous to survive. Some claim the Jesuits once accessed the deepest vaults. Their founder, Ignatius of Loyola, entered just before the order was suppressed in 1773. After their reinstatement, Jesuit libraries mysteriously contained materials overlapping with Masonic and Templar lore, some older than both. Coincidence or transfer? The Vatican denies any conspiracy. They say the archive is simply fragile, and for most visitors, that is true. You can read Galileo's trial notes, Henry VIII's letters, medieval papal decrees, but not the documents about Jerusalem, not the ones about relics, not the ones about rites, symbols, and secrets. Those remain sealed. And here lies the quiet truth. The Vatican does not need to deny the Templar legacy. It simply needs to outlast it. Time dissolves memory. Symbols fade. Stories become myth. Unless someone preserves them. Unless someone passes them hand to hand, soul to soul. Unless a brotherhood survives. Not in marble halls, but behind closed doors, in dim rooms, among men who still remember the silence of 1312. Beneath Rome, the Templar story waits, not to start a war, but to illuminate, waiting for the veil to lift, waiting for the world to read what the Church once read and feared. Because some lights, though hidden, never go out. And that brings us to a temple that no longer stands in Jerusalem, yet rises every day in ritual and memory, in darkness and in dawn, in the hearts of those who rebuild it, not with stone, but with initiation. They call themselves Freemasons, but what they build may be far older. It begins with the legend of Hiram Abiff, master architect of Solomon's Temple. According to Masonic law, he carried a secret, the word, a sacred truth passed from divine origin. 3 men tried to force it from him. He refused. They murdered him. He was buried, mourned, and finally raised by his brethren. A murdered builder, a hidden word, a resurrection. To the outside world, it is a parable, but to those within, it is memory, encoded in ritual. Because Freemasonry is not obsessed with stones. It is obsessed with a pattern. Every degree, every symbol revolves around the lost Temple of Solomon. The pillars, the chamber, the veil, the golden light from the east. Why so much devotion to a structure gone for 2,000 years? Unless the temple was never just a building, unless it was a diagram of the cosmos, a blueprint of the divine meeting the human. The Templars named themselves after that temple. Their headquarters stood upon its ancient foundations, and many believed they excavated beneath it, not for treasure, but for knowledge, blueprints, measurements, relics older than scripture. When the order fell, what they found did not vanish. It went underground. And centuries later, pieces of it resurfaced through the degrees of Freemasonry. Consider this. Masonic lodges are built symbolically as the temple. Their rituals reenact its construction, its destruction, and its resurrection. Initiates ascend steps, discover hidden chambers, retrieve sacred scrolls, and seek the lost word. These rites are not random. They are repetitions, echoes, reminders. In the Royal Arch degree, initiates descend into a vault beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple. There they find a pedestal bearing an object inscribed with a name never spoken aloud, a name lost, then found. Why such drama? Because these are not mere ceremonies, they are acts of preservation. They are how a temple destroyed in stone is rebuilt in spirit. Some believe this is the true Templar legacy, not the preservation of treasures, but the preservation of patterns. They knew the temple would fall again. They knew stone could be conquered. So they passed on the tools, the compass, the square, the plumb line, the word. They rebuilt the temple in cathedrals of silence, in cities aligned to the stars, in brotherhoods bound by vows older than kings. And today, every Masonic lodge, whether in London or Cairo, Sao Paulo or Singapore, stands in symbolic alignment with that memory. Every ritual recalls the temple's rise, its fall, and its resurrection. It is not nostalgia, it is intention, because the temple was never only a structure, it was a mirror of man, of cosmos, of what once was and what must rise again. Throughout history, the deepest truths were never taught in words. They were transmitted through experience. This was the quiet heart of the ancient mystery schools, from Egypt to Eleusis to Qumran. And it later became the hidden engine that powered both the Templars and the Freemasons. These traditions knew that not everyone could be initiated, and not everyone should. They worked through steps, veils, silences, and sacred ordeals. The process was never a lesson. It was a transformation. And what little survives of Templar initiation suggests that it was built upon layers of symbolism and secrecy, echoes that would one day reappear in Masonic ritual as if nothing had ever been lost. The church records describe strange ceremonies, nights received in darkness, touching unknown relics, being kissed in symbolic places, even renouncing the cross only to embrace it again in secret. To the Inquisition, these were signs of heresy. But seen through another lens, they resemble ancient rites of passage, a symbolic death and rebirth found across every initiatory tradition on earth. Some scholars believe that even under the distortion of torture, these confessions hint at a more complex spiritual system, not a rejection of Christ, but a stripping away of outer dogma to reveal an inner mystery. In this reading, the renunciation of the cross was not blasphemy, but a rejection of corruption, a casting off of the shell in order to reclaim the hidden truth beneath. That truth had many names. In Gnostic texts, it was the hidden light. In Kabbalah, the Ein Sof. In alchemy, the philosopher's stone. And the Templars, living for decades in the Holy Land, exposed to Jewish mysticism, Islamic Sufism, and Eastern Christian monasticism, may have woven fragments of each tradition into their rites. Their initiation may have blended Egyptian teachings, Pythagorean progression, Sufi discipline, and early Christian sacraments. The goal was not loyalty to Rome. It was transformation of the self. Centuries later, when Freemasonry emerged publicly, its initiation mirrored this structure almost exactly. The candidate is blindfolded, entering the symbolic darkness. He is led by the hand, guided by a brother, challenged, questioned, purified. And then, in a single moment, he is brought to the light. When the blindfold lifts, he sees not just the room, but the world anew. In that instant, what he believed he knew is broken open. He has died to the profane world and been reborn as a seeker. This sequence, darkness, ordeal, revelation, is ancient. But in Freemasonry, it is carefully codified. The degrees rise like steps. The entered apprentice learns the tools. The fellow craft applies them. the Master Mason dies symbolically and is raised again. Higher degrees weave in Templar echoes, vengeance for a murdered master, the recovery of a lost word, the guarding of sacred relics. Some degrees are explicitly titled Knight Templar. They involve swords, vows, altars, and the promise of a temple not made with hands. These are not decorative theatrics. They are reenactments, quiet memories of rites once performed in stone commanderies by men kneeling in the dark, pledging their lives to something unseen. At the center of both traditions lies one of the most mysterious concepts, the lost word. In Masonic lore, this word is a divine name once known, then lost, and now sought again. It is never spoken aloud. It appears only in fragments, symbols, syllables, substitutions, given to initiates who are told that the true word was lost with the death of the master builder and can only be rediscovered through inner progression. To the uninitiated, it sounds symbolic. But in the esoteric traditions that shaped the Templars and the Masons, the name was more than metaphor. It was power. To speak the true name of God or of one's higher self was to align with creation itself. Thus, to hide the word was not to lose it. It was to protect it. Geometry served a similar purpose. The tools of the craft, the compass, square, trowel, plumb line, were not merely instruments, but metaphors. The chambers of initiation were aligned to solstices and stars. Sacred numbers repeated like a pulse. 3, 7, 12. Tracing boards were painted with encrypted scenes meant to be deciphered slowly, sometimes over years. All of this points to a lineage not invented, but inherited, adapted, obscured, but never extinguished. This raises an unsettling question. If Masonic rites echo Templar initiation so closely, how much of the old knowledge survived? Is it possible that modern initiates undergo a ritual first crafted in the shadow of the Crusades, or even earlier? Some describe inner changes that cannot be explained by symbolism alone. Vivid dreams, sudden intuitions, a sense of joining a quiet conversation that has stretched across centuries. Not supernatural, but ancestral. A lineage of memory. This is why secrecy mattered, not to exclude, but to preserve. These rites were not meant for public display. They were psychological journeys designed to break and rebuild, to shape a man into a guardian of memory. Modern Masonry focuses often on fellowship and charity. Many never pursue the deeper degrees. But within the more esoteric lodges, the older work continues. Not conspiracy, but preservation. They preserve rites that once guided warriors into spiritual men, symbols whose meanings emerge only after years of contemplation. Silence, from which the lost word might one day rise again. So perhaps the question is not whether the Templars survived. Perhaps they were never meant to survive as warriors. Perhaps they evolved, laying down the sword, picking up the compass, and vanishing into ritual. In that sense, the Templars never died. They became the initiation. And if they dissolved into Freemasonry, then the next question becomes, did they retain influence? Because the true power of any secret society lies not in its symbolism, but in its reach, its presence at the quiet turning points of history. And here, the line between myth and reality blurs. Over the last 3 centuries, Freemasons appear again and again in the biographies of revolutionaries, philosophers, architects, monarchs, and presidents. The craft was present in salons where the Enlightenment was born, in assemblies where constitutions were drafted, in societies where science took root, and in courts where empires rose and fell. Never at the center, always close to it. In the 18th century, before the American and French revolutions, Masonry spread rapidly among thinkers, aristocrats, clergy, and commoners. Lodges became sanctuaries where rank was suspended and merit alone mattered. A man's birth meant nothing. His degree meant everything. This was revolutionary, not politically, but spiritually. Freemasonry didn't preach chaos. It preached order, cosmic, ethical, architectural. Its revolution was one of redesign, dismantle corrupt structures, rebuild them in proportion, in balance, in light. A temple of reason, a republic of the initiated. It is no coincidence that so many founders of the American Republic were Masons. Washington, Franklin, Revere. Washington even laid the U.S. Capitol cornerstone in full Masonic ritual, wearing an apron embroidered with symbols older than the Republic itself. The city of Washington, D.C. was designed with geometric precision, its monuments aligned according to esoteric ratios. Was this superstition, or the continuation of an older blueprint? In France, the pattern repeated. Many of the early revolutionaries were Masons, Danton, Desmoulins, Robespierre, alongside nobles, clergy, and philosophers. Lodges became laboratories, where the Enlightenment was refined. The French Revolution later spiraled into terror, but its early ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, echo the triple pillars of Masonic thought. Yet Freemasonry was never unified. Some lodges were conservative, others radical. Some supported monarchy, others demanded its fall. The craft flowed like water, adapting, shaping, influencing, without ever fully revealing its hand. Consider the British Empire. Many colonial governors were Masons, as were officers of the East India Company. The first Grand Lodge in Kolkata was founded in 1730, before the Raj and before formal colonization. In many regions, Masonic lodges appeared before churches or courts, becoming quiet diplomatic hubs. Not out of conquest, but because Freemasonry understood a truth older than nations. Structure precedes sovereignty. First, you build the temple, then you occupy it. In the 19th century, nationalist movements across Europe and South America were often led by Masons. Simon Bolivar, Giuseppe Garibaldi, men who used Masonic ideals to challenge empires and birth republics. Not because Freemasonry commanded them, but because its symbols provided a grammar of rebellion, power earned through enlightenment, not inherited by birth. Yet tension always existed. Some monarchs embraced Masonry, Frederick the Great, Edward VII. Others banned it. The Catholic Church condemned it repeatedly, declaring it a rival force. To the Church, Freemasonry was dangerous because it offered a path to truth outside the hierarchy, a temple built not on dogma, but on initiation. And so the story continues, quietly, symbolically, moving in shadows and salons, lodges and libraries, wars and revolutions. Not as conspiracy, but as current. A silent structure, a pattern of influence, a memory that refuses to disappear. Why did the Church condemn Freemasonry so fiercely? Officially, it cited secrecy, secularism, and the fear that private oaths could undermine public authority. But beneath the proclamations lay something deeper, an instinctive recognition that Freemasonry carried a counter-theology, one rooted not in revelation, but in initiation, not in obedience, but in awakening. A worldview built not upon papal decree, but upon personal ascent through degrees of understanding. And in this quiet architecture of light, the Church sensed an echo of the Templar problem all over again. The Templars, once the Church's own knights, had grown too wealthy, too connected, too independent, too strange. They became a shadow faith within Christendom, men who wore the cross, but answered to a different authority. When the church destroyed them, it was not only political, it was existential. It feared a rival priesthood rising within its walls. Perhaps Freemasonry inherited that same suspicion. Its very structure, the 3 degrees, the inner chamber, the veiled knowledge, felt like a lineage of power preserved behind the altar, moving quietly where thrones could not see. Because refined power never announces itself. It hides. It moves in angles, in symbols, in stones laid with intention. It speaks through architecture and ritual and silence. Some say modern Freemasonry has lost that ancient potency, becoming symbolic rather than sovereign, a gentle echo rather than a hidden hand. That may be true, but the symbols remain, the tracing boards remain, the blazing star remains. The lost word still whispers through certain rites in certain lodges, where the old fire has not been extinguished, but simply banked, waiting. Because the craft was never about conquering nations, it was about continuity. It was about preserving a system of initiation older than the Enlightenment and possibly older than the Templars themselves. A system designed to survive persecution, revolution, suppression, even obscurity. So if you wish to know who shapes the world, do not look only to crowns and parliaments. Look to the geometry behind them, to the dates on their cornerstones, to the whispered oaths in rooms without windows. Look to the architects, not the kings. History remembers the kings. But the world was built by masons. There is also another whisper running beneath the rituals, a thread more dangerous than architecture or allegory, a whisper of blood, not spilled but preserved. Because beneath the twin pillars, behind the sacred compass and square, behind the geometry of light, lies an idea far more explosive. That some knowledge was passed not only from teacher to student, but from father to son. That the Templar legacy may not have been only ideological, but biological. This rumor begins with the Grail, not the cup of legend, but the symbol behind it. In older texts, the Grail is a vessel of wisdom, but in later French romances, written curiously after the fall of the Templars, the Grail transforms. It becomes a bloodline, a lineage descending from Christ through Mary Magdalene. An idea dismissed as myth until you notice its timing. These reinterpretations bloom precisely as the Templars are hunted, tortured, scattered. It is almost as if, as the physical order collapsed, a myth rose in its place to preserve their truth in another form. Fast forward to Freemasonry. In high-degree Masonry sits one of its most enigmatic symbols, the rose and cross. To most, it symbolizes resurrection. To others, it is a veiled memory of sacred union, the rose as the womb, the cross as the suffering through which life is born. A symbol not of death, but of lineage. And then there is genealogy. Both Templars and Freemasons were obsessed with descent. Many Templars came from noble lines. Many Freemasons kept detailed family records. In some high-degree circles in the 18th and 19th centuries, members claimed descent from Rex Deus, the kings of God, families said to descend from ancient priestly lines, even from David, even from Christ. Fantastic? Perhaps. But persistent? Yes. So persistent, so widespread, so carefully preserved that it suggests not delusion, but design. In southern France, Cathar country, Templar country, Grail country, the puzzle deepens. Before the church annihilated them, the Cathars entrusted their secrets to protectors. Some believe those protectors were proto-Templars. Later, in the same lands, strange noble families appear, bearing symbols of the Grail, echoing ancient priesthoods, tied by rumor to hidden blood. The House of Sinclair in Scotland is one of the most intriguing examples. They built Rosslyn Chapel, a structure dripping with esoteric carvings, Masonic geometry, Hebrew columns, plants carved before Europe even knew of the New World. The Sinclairs served as hereditary Grand Masters of Scottish Masonry, and they claimed descent from Templars who fled France. Was it only legend, or were they safeguarding a human lineage? In Masonry, bloodlines are rarely spoken of openly, but they appear in shadows, in degrees where lineage gives the right to hold symbolic keys. In the title, Son of the Widow, a phrase that may hint at ancient messianic descent. Some esoteric orders speak of initiatic lineage not as metaphor, but as living thread. A descent not of teachings, but of essence. In this view, the Grail is not a cup or a code. The Grail is a person, a vessel that walks, a soul that remembers. Could such a person exist, descended from priestly lines, guarded by Templars, preserved through Masonic ritual? Impossible to confirm. But if such a descendant lived, he would not sit on a throne. He would live quietly, initiated, hidden, carrying the secret, never proclaiming it. And perhaps that is the truth the Church feared most. Not that the Templars found treasure, but that they protected a line. The Templars were architects of power, but the Freemasons who inherited their symbols reshaped that power into nations. Nowhere is this clearer than in the founding of the United States. America's birth was not only political, it was Masonic. George Washington, a lifelong Mason, laid the Capitol's cornerstone in full ritual, wearing the apron and using the silver trowel of the craft. Benjamin Franklin, Grand Master of Pennsylvania, corresponded with the French Masonic intelligentsia and carried their ideas across the Atlantic. John Hancock, James Monroe, Paul Revere, all Masons. They saw the American experiment as a chance to build not a nation, but a temple of reason, a republic of light. Washington, D.C. itself is a geometric message, radial avenues forming Masonic tools, monuments aligned to solstices, the Capitol and the White House placed on points that form symbols known only to the initiated. To the untrained eye, it is a city. To others, it is a tracing board carved at national scale. Then there is the Great Seal, an unfinished pyramid of 13 steps crowned by the all-seeing eye. Official explanations exist, but symbolism speaks louder. The pyramid is the eternal project. The eye is the inner light. The Latin below, novus, ordo seclorum, whispers a new order of the ages. Not domination, but design. A world built deliberately, stone by symbolic stone. The Constitution itself mirrors Masonic structure. 3 branches as 3 pillars, checks and balances as perfect proportions. Even the idea of a republic, free individuals bound by oath, echoes the lodge. Across the ocean, French Freemasons helped ignite the Enlightenment and fuel the debates that burned into revolution. In Latin America, Bolivar and San Martin planned independence in Masonic lodges. Schools, sciences, civic architecture, all bear faint fingerprints of the craft. Not because Freemasonry controlled history, but because it seeded the idea that society could be built like a temple, rational, ethical, intentional. Critics say there's no proof of a unified Masonic conspiracy. And they are right. That is precisely the point. Freemasonry does not command. It inspires. It does not seize power. It shapes those who will one day hold it. And that is how a mystery school survives. Quietly, symbolically, through architecture, through ritual, through the laying of one careful stone upon another. Perhaps today, many have forgotten the symbols. The Capitol still stands. The seal still bears the eye. But the memory behind them has faded. And perhaps that forgetting is itself part of the design. A true mystery school guards its wisdom not through proclamation, but through permanence. Written into stone, encoded in ceremony, whispered in the spaces between silence and light. Scattered though they became, the vision of a world built upon sacred principle did not die. It drifted quietly through generations, past brick by invisible brick, until one day it reappeared not as an order of knights, but as a nation, a republic, a new world temple. And even if few remember the blueprint, the structure remembers. The alignments remain. The symbols still speak. You only need to know how to read the plans. If the Templars vanished and the Freemasons inherited their legacy, then that legacy had to be preserved in plain sight, hidden not in scrolls or proclamations, but in architecture, in design, in the quiet geometry of cities. Because unlike books, buildings do not burn so easily. They endure. They transmit meaning across centuries, across languages, across entire civilizations. They are silent scriptures. And so whoever the Brotherhood truly was, they left their teachings not only in lodges, but in stone, in cities, in cathedrals, in monuments that millions walk past each day without ever knowing they are moving through a temple without walls. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland remains one of the clearest examples. Built in the 15th century by William Sinclair, a man tied by legend to surviving Templar lines, the chapel is a masterpiece of coded architecture. Over 100 carvings of the Green Man stare from the stone, an ancient pre-Christian symbol of rebirth. There are carvings of maize and aloe, plants unknown, in Europe until decades after Columbus sailed. The entire interior follows Masonic geometry, and many scholars believe it encodes Kabbalistic teachings and the stages of initiation. Rosslyn is more than a church. It is a stone cipher, a meeting point of Christian, pagan, Templar, and Masonic symbolism woven into one intricate matrix. But Rosslyn is only one voice in a larger chorus. The Gothic cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame, Chartres, Reims, were built by stonemasons who would later become the operative roots of Freemasonry. These cathedrals were not just churches, they were cosmic diagrams of heaven mirrored on earth. Notre Dame follows sacred proportions drawn from Pythagorean mathematics. Its rose windows, its solar alignments, its labyrinth, each encodes astronomical, alchemical, and mystical knowledge. The builders communicated not with words, but with weight, angle, and light. Initiation was not spoken, it was carved. Then come the obelisks, ancient Egyptian symbols of solar power, later embraced by Masons, now rising from Paris, London, New York, and Washington, D.C. The Washington Monument is more than a patriotic tower. It is a 550-foot Egyptian obelisk built upon a Masonic cornerstone laid with ritual precision. Its measurements translate into mystical numbers. Its capstone inscribed, Laus Deo, praise be to God, faces the rising sun, just as ancient temples once did. Walk the National Mall, and the pattern reveals itself. The U.S. Capitol faces a straight line connecting it to the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial, a layout reminiscent of ancient temples aligned to dawn. Aerial views show triangles, stars, and the unmistakable form of a compass and square etched into the city's grid. Coincidence? Or deliberate design, turning the capital of a modern republic into an open-air lodge? The pattern spreads. Salt Lake City, founded by Brigham Young, a man shaped deeply by Masonic ritual, follows symbolic grids found in esoteric cosmology. The Mormon temple is heavy with Masonic and astrological motifs. Early Mormon initiation rites nearly mirrored those of the craft. Across Europe and South America, the same symbols rise again. In Paris, the Place de la Concorde features an obelisk flanked by fountains of duality, a classic Masonic theme. The Eiffel Tower was designed by Gustave Eiffel, a known Mason who aligned it with sacred geometrical proportions. The gardens of Versailles echo hermetic principles of order over chaos, with sun symbolism radiating from the palace like the rays of a deity. Buenos Aires, São Paulo, Manila. In city after city, during revolutions, independence movements, and the formation of new states, newly empowered elites, many of them Freemasons, turned to the oldest symbols they knew: the square, the compass, the rising sun, the unfinished pyramid, even where masonry was banned. Under Hitler, under Franco, under Stalin, the symbols survived in hidden corners, encoded in theater, sets, private buildings, even postage stamps. The idea of sacred architecture never vanished. It simply went underground. It raises an unsettling question. Is the modern world truly secular? Or are we living inside a symbolic infrastructure, a network of esoteric alignments and ritual geometry that only the initiated can fully read? Perhaps everything from courthouses to city halls, from rotundas to plazas, was designed as part of a vast, unacknowledged temple, a map for the soul disguised as civic design. Once you learn to see it, it is everywhere. Twin columns guarding doorways, checkerboard floors in public buildings, eyes carved into stone, staircases built in sets of 3, 7, or 12, entrances aligned with equinoxes, rotundas constructed according to sacred ratios, the Vatican Secrets hidden in skylights, the all-seeing eye woven into seals and monuments. Always the quiet suggestion that what you see is only a fraction of what exists. Some believe these symbols prove a hidden hand guiding civilization, slowly, patiently, through architecture and memory. Others say it is simply the echo of a tradition now mostly forgotten. But either way, the structures remain, and through them, the symbols speak. They speak of balance, of ascent, of the eternal return. They speak of the Templars who may have encoded their knowledge in fortress chapels. They speak of the Freemasons who ritualized that knowledge and spread it across continents. And they speak of the inner temple that every initiate is called to build, stone by symbolic stone, in silence. Perhaps we are surrounded by temples, walking through initiation chambers disguised as cities. Perhaps every courthouse and rotunda is part of a vast ritual space, not to deceive, but to remind, to guide the seeker back to the center, where the compass turns, where the light falls, where the true work begins. And maybe that is the oldest secret of all. Not that power hides, but that it reveals itself only to those who learn to see. But even within the craft, something subtle shifted. The higher degrees, the esoteric, contemplative, initiatic content, slowly became seen as symbolic theater rather than maps of real transformation. The emphasis drifted from inner alchemy to outer fellowship. The temple still stood, but the flame on its altar dimmed. This tension is ancient. Every mystery school oscillates between the mystical and the material, between initiation and institution. The Templars themselves had begun this way, warriors and monks carrying an inner fire. But over time, as wealth accumulated and rituals hardened, the spiritual current grew harder to access. When they fell, only fragments remained. The Freemasons preserved many of those fragments, but as respectability grew, secrecy weakened, and with it, the initiatic thread. The 20th century brought exposure. Books spilled secrets once whispered in darkness. Public curiosity soared, but wisdom declined. Conspiracy theories replaced contemplation. Symbols were misread. Rituals reduced to curiosities. Many entered the outer temple, but few knew how to build. Inside masonry, this created divides. Esoteric lodges clung to the ancient ways. Full ritual, strict discipline, study of Kabbalah, alchemy, sacred geometry. But these were small groups. Meanwhile, mainstream lodges leaned toward charity, civic duty, social harmony, worthy goals, but far from the inner work. The great work, the inner ascent, faded. Then came the dictators, Hitler, Franco, Mussolini, who feared what they did not understand. Freemasonry was banned, temples looted, records seized, brothers imprisoned. For decades, the craft went silent. When it resurfaced, it was alive, but thinner. The rituals intact, the memory frayed. And yet, in the quiet corners, the fire endured. In lodges that still work in full form. In brothers who still meditate on the ancient tools. In the moment when the blindfold is removed and the initiate sees not just the room, but the structure of meaning beneath the world. The current remains, faint but living. Still, the modern world moved faster than the old ways could adapt. Technology replaced contemplation. Information replaced initiation. Why seek the hidden word when you can search the internet? Why climb the inner mountain when shortcuts abound? And so the deep orders, the ones carrying the purest Templar echoes, began to collapse, not through betrayal, but through forgetfulness. Generations passed through the ritual, but not the transformation. They memorized, but did not awaken. Yet the tradition is not dead. In quiet minds, in still rooms, in late-night questions about symbols and stars, the current flickers. People are returning to the old texts, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, sacred geometry. They are searching again for the meaning behind the eye, the pyramid, the lost word. And in these questions lies possibility, a reawakening, a rebuilding of the inner temple, not in stone, but in awareness. But this rebuilding cannot rely on inherited structures. It must be a conscious reactivation of the initiatic current, not nostalgia, but necessity. Because in a world fractured and restless, the idea of structure with soul has never been more vital. Perhaps the Templars knew their order would fall, but planted a seed anyway. Perhaps the Freemasons carved temples not to last forever, but to encode a pattern that future seekers could rediscover. Perhaps the collapse is not an ending, but a return to silence, the moment before the stone is lifted. They move between worlds, between sword and prayer, between chapel and battlefield. And when their order was shattered, the essence of what they carried, their discipline, their symbols, their inner fire, did not vanish with their bodies. It moved into memory, into ritual, into other hands. The Freemasons, centuries later, did not claim to be knights. They claimed to be builders. But building was always the Templars' work. They built fortresses, bridges, commanderies, vaults. They built networks of power. They built meaning. And so perhaps the shift from knight to mason was not a transformation at all, but a return to the craft behind the sword. Look closely at the rituals, and the echoes grow louder. In the Templar trials, the knights were accused of strange kisses, secret signs, hidden words, rites performed in darkness. These were condemned as heresy. But in another lens, they resembled the initiations of mystery schools and the early degrees of Freemasonry, the blindfold, the testing of courage, the symbolic death, the raising into light. Two traditions separated by centuries, yet bound by a single architecture of awakening. Look at the symbols. The Templar cross, the Masonic square, the identical twin pillars guarding every sacred threshold, the rose and cross entwined in the Rosicrucians, another order said to descend from Templar survivors. These were not invented symbols. They were inherited symbols, evolved symbols, and symbols only survive when someone needs them to. Look at the geography. Portugal absorbed its Templars completely, transforming them into the Order of Christ, the very order that funded the voyages of Henry the Navigator and carried the Templar cross on the sails that opened the world. Scotland sheltered refugees and later became the cradle of early operative and speculative masonry. Switzerland, with its fortified cantons, holds architecture eerily aligned with Templar strongholds. These places became seeds, and seeds grow in silence. Look at the legends. After Jacques de Molay was burned in Paris, stories spread that a secret group of knights escaped with the treasury, the archives, perhaps something greater. Some claimed they traveled north. Some claimed they hid underground. Some claimed they blended into stonemasons' guilds, hiding in the one profession that could move freely across borders. Even if myths exist for reasons. They appear where memory refuses to die. And look at the mindset. The Templars believed the world had layers, not just political, but spiritual. They believed in the sanctity of geometry, the power of oaths, the silence of discipline, the transformation of the soul through ordeal. Freemasonry adopted the same architecture of meaning. 3 degrees echoing the 3 vows, a lost word echoing a lost truth, a temple destroyed and rebuilt not in stone, but in man. This is not evidence of inheritance in the legal sense. It is evidence of inheritance in the mythic sense. Like a current of electricity that jumps from one wire to another, the initiatic spark survived by leaping into new vessels. The name changed, the garments changed, but the work remained. A straight line between Templar and Mason may never be found, but perhaps straight lines were never the point. Mystery traditions move like rivers, vanishing underground, emerging miles away, yet carrying the same water. What matters is not the institutions that rise and fall. What matters is the current that flows beneath them. And that current, the initiatic flame, the search for the word, the building of the inner temple that survived. Not as an order, but as a pattern. Not as a lineage of armor, but as a lineage of understanding. So when we ask whether the Templars became the Freemasons, we are really asking this. Did the idea survive? Did the fire pass from one set of hands to another? Did the ritual of awakening continue beneath new symbols? And the answer is yes. Quietly, indirectly, but undeniably, yes. Not in the parchment trail, but in the architecture of the soul. Not in the archives, but in the symbols that refuse to die. Not in the uniforms, but in the whispered word that still waits behind the veil. For the Templars were never meant to survive as warriors. They were meant to survive as builders, and builders survive through what they shape, what they teach, what they remember. Even now, if you stand in the silence of a lodge at midnight, or in the echoing vault of a cathedral, or on the steps of a monument aligned with the rising sun, you might feel it, the faint ember of an ancient flame. A lineage, not of blood, but of intention. A memory carried in stone and ritual and shadow. The Templars did not become the Freemasons in the way history keeps score. They became them in the way light becomes a reflection, in the way truth becomes a symbol, in the way a fire becomes an ember waiting to rise again. And so, we return to the moment where the fire should have gone out, but didn't. When their order fell, The men were scattered, but the idea endured. It slipped beneath the surface like a submerged river and began to travel beneath history. It moved through families, through symbols, through stonemasons' gatherings, through whispered stories that refused to die. And when the world looked away, it rose again, quietly, patiently, in a new form. The Freemasons did not need to become Templars in body to inherit their flame. They only needed to inherit the work. And they did, through architecture, through ritual, through a belief that the world is not merely built of stone, but of symbols, of proportion, of unseen laws that shape the soul as surely as they shape the cathedral. Did any Templar survive to help seed early Masonry? Perhaps. Portugal and Scotland were safe havens, untouched by the papal arrests. Families like the Sinclairs in Scotland and the Banzas in Portugal have carried rumours for centuries. Rumours of hidden rites, of old vows, of knowledge passed quietly from knight to mason. But even if no living knight ever stepped into a lodge, his memory did. His fire did. His vow did. His architecture of meaning did. And that, perhaps, is the deepest truth we've uncovered. The question was never whether one order literally turned into another. The question was whether a story became a structure, whether a myth became a method, whether the silence of one age became the blueprint of the next. And all signs suggest that it did. Walk into a Masonic lodge today, anywhere in the world, and you will find a quiet echo of the vanished knights. You'll see the twin pillars that once guarded the Temple Mount. You'll hear the name Hiram Abif, whose martyrdom mirrors the legends of Jacques de Molay. You'll watch a candidate pass through darkness, ordeal, and raising. The same pattern of symbolic death and rebirth that has followed initiates since the mystery schools of Egypt. Most who witness it do not realize they are walking through doorways carved centuries earlier by men in white mantles bearing a red cross. But the echo remains. The legacy remains, and it continues to build. Because the great work, the work of reconciling opposites, of building the temple within, of preserving knowledge through meaning, did not die on a pyre in Paris. It transformed. It migrated. It became the geometry of cities, the seal on your dollar bill, the obelisks aligned with the sunrise, the rituals whispered behind closed doors, the symbols carved in stone waiting for someone patient enough to notice. And if you're listening closely, you'll notice something else. The mystery is still alive. Because true mysteries do not resolve themselves. They transform the one who follows them. You were promised an answer. Did the Templars become the Freemasons? And the truth, whispered across centuries, is layered. Not officially, not historically, but essentially, yes. Not as an institution, but as an inheritance. Not through paperwork, but through pattern. Not through blood, but through memory. The Templars were warriors of sword and sanctuary. The Freemasons became builders of lodge and law. The first held land. The second held meaning. But both worked toward a single architecture, the construction of an inner temple. And perhaps that is why the thread refuses to break, because we never quite reach the end of it. Another carving appears. Another cathedral aligns with the stars. Another legend surfaces at just the right moment. The absence of proof becomes the presence of possibility. We are left with a trail of silence, a ritual reenacting a death no historian can date, a pyramid with no summit, a martyred name spoken in dimly lit rooms, Jacques de Molay, remembered in every Knights Templar degree of Masonry. His betrayal reenacted, his memory honored, his fire carried forward. This is not nostalgia. It is not romanticism. It is memory turned into architecture. Because the temple was never just a building. It was a structure of intention, of layers and levels, of veils and vows, of truths hidden so deeply they could only be found by those willing to be transformed in the seeking. And perhaps that is the final secret. The temple isn't something you uncover. It's something you build, slowly, quietly, inwardly. For all this time, the treasure was not buried in the earth. It was engraved into the psyche. The Templars gave us a myth. The Freemasons gave us a method. But what survives is not a relic, not a ritual, not a throne. What survives is the invitation. The world still needs builders, inner builders, those who can see the hidden structure behind appearances. So the temple stands, not in Scotland or France, not beneath Rosslyn or under the streets of Washington, but everywhere, in symbols misunderstood, in rituals half-remembered, in cities aligned with ancient stars, in silent hands placing meaning upon meaning, brick upon invisible brick, even when no one else is watching. And somewhere tonight, in a darkened room, the initiate still knocks. A voice still asks, "Who comes here?" And a silence still answers, "One who seeks." So let it end not with an answer, but with a doorway. Because if the Templars never truly died, if the Freemasons are still building, if the treasure is meaning rather than gold, then the work continues, and perhaps now it's yours to carry.